there's a Go library that that we have worked on at Netflix that we use with our internal CLI called Newt, but that also is supposed to be usable with the Spin CLI. We use that the CLI experience for, so we've implemented several operations for the CLI for things like exporting the infrastructure for your existing application into a delivery config. So making it easy to go from your current application into a managed version, or publishing changes to that delivery config, that YAML file into Spinnaker if you wanted to update infrastructure delivery requirements. But there's other operational features like listing of your environments that you can do from the CLI, but there's actually quite a lot of other things that could be really interesting to implement from a CLI standpoint that could be really beneficial for this new approach. Delivery configurations, as I mentioned, are YAML files, so developers may actually go in and make changes to those YAML files directly if they have some specific updates that they want to make. We do have a validation endpoint for that YAML configuration when you submit it, but which is exposed through the CLI. But there isn't really any like client-side linting or templating or other tools that we've explored at the moment for composing or making doing interesting things with the YAML file. So there could be some interesting opportunities around that as well. So I think I think that's about it. There's a whole lot of detail. I'm
great.
Happy to answer any questions. I'm sure Emily can probably answer them better than me, but I'll open the floor.
And feel free to unmute yourself and ask. And you can also ask in gardening general, and we'll get the questions over. I guess I have a question, which is what resources should I, like, I know there've been some resources out on managed delivery, like a few blog posts. What's the most current, best resource that I can consult to help me level set on managed delivery and get stoked about it?
Emily, do you want to tackle that one?
Oh, sure, I guess. If you want to learn more, I would say watching our talk from the summit is a good way to get like an overview of where we were a couple months ago. And then if you want to talk to people about it, you can jump into the Spinnaker as code SIG, or you can join our SIG and put some questions on the agenda. We have a super light agenda at all times. We're really looking for questions and people to engage.
Currently at the resources that we've implemented support for, since we are an AWS house, we have support for server groups, ALBs, CLBs, and security groups currently for infrastructure resources.
I'm also posting a link to our docs. Joel mentioned subscribe to the GitHub repo, which is definitely a good point. And we have some docs that we're starting to add on Spinnaker IO, which are like docs on how to use things, not necessarily how to set it up or get running or contributing. Information about that kind of stuff is best done in person or virtually in person.
I'm going to add those links to the to Slack. Just in case you're following along on Slack, YouTube, wherever you are. All right, what questions do you have? What questions do you have?
More than a question, I have just like a request to see like, or to hear their thoughts about like what's really the future for Spinnaker and their community. So we talk about like multi-substrate, multi-cloud CD system. In our experience, it's not that seamless to configure what pipeline from one cloud to another cloud. There are certain things that still need to configure. So is this really a system or a platform that is going to be a multi-substrate, just growing this community, or it's just going to be mainly used in one substrate?
I can take that. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes, we
Cool.
can. Rob Zener of the TOC.
Hello. So right now we know that there's not really a public vision posted anywhere for Spinnaker, but that's something that we're actually working on right now between the TOC and the steering committee. So it's kind of nascent at this point of exactly like what we want to do with the multi-cloud positioning of Spinnaker. We're trying to balance, like, do we want to actually have, like, lean in even more into the abstractions of being multi-cloud, or converging more onto a more Kubernetes-centric control plane? And that's very much up in the air, and we don't really know where that's going to go. But for the time being, it's just kind of, the main vision is going towards a more managed delivery and declarative approach, and for people to kind of implement those abstractions per cloud provider. There's really no way around the fact that none of these cloud providers have the same abstractions, and we have to write a bunch of glue code to make them all behave the same. So I think if there's any desire for every single cloud provider to be behaving exactly the same inside of Spinnaker, I think that that's going to be a little bit too far of a stretch, simply because Azure is not going to be the same as AWS. AWS is never going to be the same as Kubernetes and that kind of thing. So we're trying to figure out, like, what is the correct abstraction level that everyone can kind of work on, so that you can have a multi-cloud or a single control plane over many clouds. But we're not exactly sure what that looks like yet. I don't know if that answered your question.
So one thing that I would like to add is there are two ways to see it, right? I think you were more focused on what's your driver endpoint, right? You say, like, maybe, yes, we go multi-cloud, or we way more focused on the Kubernetes side. But we also need to think about, like, where Spinnaker runs and from where it's getting artifacts. And so one of the deals, one of the issues that we're dealing right now is, assume that you're running a Spinnaker and you test certain functionality feature in GCP, for instance, just to mention one, right? Pops up, and you start designing your CI/CD process based on certain functionality well tested in one cloud. And when you're moving your infrastructure to a different cloud, or not just move, like you diverse your infrastructure to a different cloud, it seems like the features are not 100% compatible. So just going to the PubSub, we found that it's not exactly the same work. And that's another dimension of the problem of the multi-substrate that I would like to see taken into account by the community.
Just so I understand that correctly, are you saying you want, like, the PubSub side of things to be more generic, or you would like the more, like, artifacts and CI process to be more uniform across clouds?
Yes, the latter, right? Because even that you have, if you focus in the Kubernetes API, right, in the Kubernetes provider, you still run Kubernetes in different formats, right? Could be in different clouds. Yep. So the ecosystem running should be, like, more kind of like homogeneous.
Yeah, so specifically on the CI and artifacts side of things, there is a new SIG for CI that I think is aiming to kind of address this gap inside of Spinnaker, that, like, you have this delivery and infrastructure management system that is supposed to encompass the whole like continuous delivery workflow, but then we never really had a good but But now that there's the CI SIG, we're looking to actually kind of make a more uniform story for continuous delivery, and that would have artifacts and plugging into various clouds and that kind of thing. That's kind of under their scope.
Hey, this is a great conversation. So I'm going to propose that if folks are interested, no, it's okay. If folks are interested, I think we should continue this in our birds of a feather discussions tomorrow. So if we'll pop up a managed delivery group, and if folks want to join and talk more about managed delivery, let's do it. I want to keep this conversation going. And I also want to keep the lunchtime talks going. So thank you so much, Emily, Rob, and Michael from Netflix for sharing about this very exciting project that I think is a game changer for Spinnaker. And without further ado, I would also like to introduce Isaac Mascara, Isaac Mascara, the CTO of Armory, and Kate McAlevey, our head of culture. And they are going to do a talk for you. I'll let them intro the title of the talk. And speakers, let me know what you need. Thanks for coming. And thanks again to Netflix. A round of applause for Netflix. Forgot about that. This probably sounds really gross in my mic, but I'm going to keep doing it. Let's see the applause. All right. We love you, Netflix. Thank you for Spinnaker. We owe you so much.
All right, take it away, Isaac.
All right. So thank you for the intro, Roz. So one of the things that we really wanted to talk about is around not just the digital transformation and the technical challenges that I think all of us are very familiar with, but how that ties with really the cultural aspects of any organization and how they interact with each other. And really kind of go into that. So Kate, why don't you give a little bit of your background, kind of your initial foray with Armory, and then how you ended up working with all of our customers.
Thanks, Isaac. So yeah, Kate here. Sorry, I'm recovering right now from a certain infection. So forgive me, I'm a little out of breath. But so my background is well, first of all, I'm the head of culture and leadership development at Armory. My background is in organizational psychology and business and culture transformation. And I was brought into Armory to help transform actually how Armory was functioning, really from moving away from a hierarchical structure to a flatter organization. And where the control was at the edges, the decisions were at the edges. And as I learned more about Spinnaker, as I was onboarded into Armory, I was like, this company wants to literally operate like Spinnaker. And it's kind of started to blow my mind and think about how the tool was kind of influencing our actual culture. And then as I dug in further and I learned about what our customers were really struggling with in the digital transformation space, I realized that 80 to 85% of what I was hearing was a lot of cultural, behavioral transformation issues. So, Isaac and I have really been partnering for the last several months, basically, on seeing where these two things tie together. And so it's interesting. He'll talk a little bit about the similar vocabulary, the similar theories that we see. And oftentimes what we're noticing is that cultural transformation and digital transformation are happening in isolation for some reason. But at the end of the day, what I think is most interesting is even when you're just leveraging new software, you're asking for behavior change, you're asking for a values change. And so it's really important to actually do both at the same time in order to really expedite your success and make it as smooth as possible. So that's kind of a quick snapshot of my timeline over the past 7 months at Armory.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I noticed you and I, as you were doing your work internally at Armory, is that you were using a lot of the same language that we were using in technology. So you were using words like resiliency, right? And that ties very closely to chaos engineering. You were using words like getting rid of dependencies. What happens when your boss or your manager leaves the room? Can you continue to function and do work? And all of those things were the exact same kind of conversations we were having with respect to technology and microservices and chaos engineering and all of those topics that we talk about. And I realized that it had that we were using the same language. On top of that, one of the things that we observed with a lot of our customers and just people with Spinnaker is that obviously Spinnaker was born at Netflix. And it's used for so many different kind of deployments at Netflix. And as we went out into the marketplace and people want Spinnaker and they are adopting Spinnaker and starting to use Spinnaker, but it takes them an enormous amount of time to really get any type of adoption going, right? And so for the longest time, we Armory spent a lot of time looking at the product, right? We're like, how do we reduce the time to get people to install? Or maybe we need to make a better UI or UX or whatever. You know, we focused really heavily on the product. And when Kate came into the company, we realized that, like, no, the product works. We know that it's successful within these large organizations like Netflix and others. So what's the difference here? And when we started to kind of survey the companies internally to Armory that were successful with Spinnaker and had moved faster than others, it really came down to the culture. Like, we started identifying, was it the skill of the team? Was it the knowledge of the team? Was it their infrastructure set up prior to using Spinnaker? And the only thing that really stood out heavily was, in fact, just like, how do they think about technology and really, like, when you're moving to something like microservices, which of course Spinnaker is really meant to deploy, like, your people and your thoughts about how you think of technology have to change with it. And so that's really what we want to talk about today, which is like, great, you guys decided on Kubernetes and microservices, but what are the behavioral changes that you need to see come with it in order to make yourself successful with Spinnaker, or honestly, any tool? This isn't necessarily just about Spinnaker, but with any tool.
So one of the kind of interesting situations that we found ourselves in was also looking at kind of like it's not just the values, it's also just like how to use the product, right? Like Spinnaker and other open source projects require often like a lot of freedom, a lot of autonomy, and a lot of like ability to just like be able to deploy when you want, right? And so when you get this software, it's not helpful if you're trying to be really restrictive. Like a lot of customers get it and they're like, oh, I want to control it completely, right? They like lock it away in a cave and they're like, I'll use it maybe like once a week or like something ridiculous, right? And it's really like their beliefs and values, their fear, their like need to control things that are actually creating a lot more friction. Like they think they're creating more safety and they're actually causing way more problems for themselves. And so that's probably one of the biggest things that we have to get over with our customers. And Isaac, maybe you could talk a little bit about more of like the microservices and like the monolith and kind of incurring costs.
Yeah. So again, moving, everybody wants to move to microservices. It's not really a debate. Are they doing it for the right reasons? Who knows? But we know that everybody wants to move to microservices. And the idea behind kind of going to microservices is that ultimately you're really decoupling dependencies, right? And you want them to be loosely coupled versus tightly coupled. And people believe that if you do that in technology, you can just kind of check a box and you're off to the races. And really what that also means is that you have to loosely decouple the team organization and the org structure as well. And that is actually probably one of the biggest moves, which is like, okay, moving from the monolith to microservices and using Spinnaker, is that you actually have to change your org structure. And if you don't, you end up incurring all of the costs of microservices in a different architecture and none of the benefit, because what ends up happening is you end up coupling the people behaviors and deployments. And so we see a lot of customers using Spinnaker to do what we call the distributed monolith. They've broken everything out into microservices, but they deploy them all together. So that's one of the big anti-patterns we see, where you have 30 to 35 microservices, and then they ask us, well, how do we deploy all of these at the same time? And you're just like, well, that's kind of like the not the point with microservices. And they do that because their organizational structure also forces them to do that, right? The QA team sits somewhere else. The operation team sits somewhere else, maybe in a different building, maybe in a different country. So this happens frequently, where we see the developers might be in Ireland, but the ops team might be in California, And when you have this, you know, not the right accountability structure, you end up adopting tools like Spinnaker and Kubernetes, it's so much more overhead and none of the benefit there.
So with that, something we've noticed now that we ask our customers pretty early on, like how close are you, or how interested are you into having like full service ownership? Because we're realizing specifically with Spinnaker, like the more adoption teams have of service ownership, the better that they're actually going to do in this situation, and with Spinnaker in particular. Right, but because there's like such high amount of accountability, there's such a high amount of like freedom, and also just like the end-to-end ownership is extremely critical, and to getting code into pipeline and moving things along. But also with like chaos engineering, it's fascinating to see like if you're willing and bold enough to test your system and actually find out where dependencies are, when the dependencies are gone, how are things rerouted. It's interesting to think about that at a cultural level. What happens when your manager is not working with you? What happens if somebody is really sick and can't help? Like, how do you build resilient systems and cultures and not just resilient software?
Hey, Kate, I have a good kind of point to bring up, which is as people move into, like, they're bringing in Kubernetes, they're bringing in Spinnaker, and one of the things we're seeing is this blocking in adoption. And we talked to one of our customers, and one of the things that they mentioned was around this identity crisis. You want to talk a little bit about that and how moving to microservices like has an actual like deep psychological effect, and you will see it in the form of people resisting tools like Kubernetes and Spinnaker. You want to talk a little bit about that?
How about you start?
Yeah, so you know, we were talking to one of these leaders at a very large, you know, Fortune 100 company that is bringing in Spinnaker and microservices and changing into this idea of service ownership. And it's a pretty scary change, right? You went from, hey, I just need to code and throw my code over the wall to whoever's going to deploy it, to, oh no, now I own QA, I own security, I own my deployment, I own my operations. And that's a really scary thing for a developer, but it also changes the role of a manager too. And what we've observed is that they will actually reject it, because the role of a manager in a service ownership or a true DevOps model is that you become much more of a mentor and a coach than an actual like project manager, and that creates this psychological effect of identity crisis of like, oh man, I don't have these skills. I've been a manager for the last 20 years. I know what I'm doing. And now you want me to change because you guys want to use something like Spinnaker. So then I'll reject Spinnaker. You know, we saw that happen as well. And yeah, so Kate, how do you transition, I think, people from that fear of, oh man, I'm going to have all this extra work to do, but in reality, it'll make you go faster. And then also like the role changes, like, you know, I think Andy's told this story about Netflix a long time ago about how ops people needed to turn into DevOps people and more of I guess actually software developers, right? There was no role for ops people at Netflix, and really came down to platform teams. And that's a big transition. How do you suggest that organizations go through that mental change?
Yeah, so when they're talking about this identity shift, I also really think it's about it's empowerment, right? This is like, how do we actually like empower the edges, and how do we help developers feel the confidence to actually make these decisions and deploy when they need to, and to have the end-to-end ownership. And empowerment's a word that's like thrown around quite easily and loosely, but it's like, what does that actually feel like, and what does that require? And so what I usually start doing when I work in an organization, and specifically when I started working at Armory, was working with the leaders and managers, because like that identity shift is really big. So I see it as like a big two-part series. The first part is for leaders to actually letting go of control and letting go of like where they find their validation. And the validation is usually wrapped up in, oh, they're the ones who control things. They're the ones who give away the answers. They're the ones who are designing. Really like just being the answer givers can be such a problem, because like then they're the bottleneck, then they're the gate. And so the problem is they've been wildly successful, most likely in their career up into this point. And so this is a really big identity shift. It's a big ego shift. And like every leader at Armory will tell you, they're just like, Kate, this is really hard. And I'm like, I know it is really hard, right? But the payoff is huge, because then once that shift starts to happen, the next stage is really like empowering your people, your employees, your developers to be like, hey, how do I help you have the confidence? How do I help you think differently? How do I help you move past these hurdles instead of being the bottleneck to your work? So when your developers are able to function really highly and be really engaged without needing you and without needing to run everything by you, without feeling those kinds of restrictions, like it's an amazing process. So it's the leaders and managers stepping back to create space for their employees to really step into this empowered space. But it's also important for the employees to step into that. So that's an identity shift as well of ownership and having that accountability. So it's like these different, it's this big dance that happens, and it takes time because these are big behavioral shifts and big things to let go of. So in the beginning, I remember our CEO, Drodio, saying to me like, Kate, I feel like I'm incurring all of the costs of this and we're none of the benefits. This was like month 2 of our transformation. I was like, I know. I was like, you have to wait for it. You have to look for the bright moments. I was like, and slowly, like we're going to catch momentum and you're going to start seeing it, right? And about like month 3, you start seeing things shifting. It doesn't happen overnight, but like, you know it when you see it and you know it when you feel it. And so it feels slower in the beginning as you make this big shift to an empowered organization, to having like decisions made at the edges. But once it starts to happen, then like the speed of that is, it's ridiculous, right? Because the managers and leaders are no longer the bottlenecks. They're not holding things back. They're not controlling things. So we work with one big company, Fortune 100 company, and they have their one deployment window, right? Like talk about a restriction. They have one deployment window in 1 hour. And this is controlled by an organization in Europe. And like, it's ridiculous to see how limited their workflow is, because they're like, oh, this is our safety valve. This is how we keep everything together. And so having to kind of convince them to loosen the reins around like, hey, what would it mean if you actually trusted your developers? What would that look like? And everyone's like, that's crazy. Like, I can't imagine what we would do if we trusted our developers. But this is like what we're moving towards, is the trust and the engagement and being able to work when you want and when you need. And what people are actually creating and seeing their code actually be pushed to production is an amazing thing. So that was a bit all over the place, but that was a pretty broad kind of coverage of like the transformation process and the identity shifting that has to happen.
So you brought up a good point around kind of leadership. I think something that we observe is that if the VPs or SVPs and CTOs are not engaged with the transformation for Kubernetes and Spinnaker or whatever technology is being brought in, one of the things that we notice is that progress is almost like non-existent. If you know, I imagine some of the people here on this call are not VPs or SVPs and have that control. What would you suggest to these individuals, contributors to how to approach that VP or SVP to ask them to let loose of the reins and to give that freedom if they're moving to microservices, because they do go hand in hand. What's the approach here that you would suggest?
It's hard when you have to do this inside your own organization. I won't lie. This is oftentimes when you do want to have somebody come in externally to have a conversation with your VPs or your executives, but it's still absolutely worth a try. And what I usually suggest is like, I always ask like, how willing are you to try something different? Like, this is what I always am testing with anybody. Like, what's the level of willingness? And like, what's the small next step they're willing to try? And to get engagement to happen with an executive means that they also have to try something different, right? So inviting them to like a hackathon, inviting them to a place where they can experiment with you and like you get their thinking to shift. Because it's oftentimes, it's the patterns of behavior, it's the ways of thinking that we're stuck in. And the second you can start shifting that for anybody, that's when willingness happens. That's when like new thoughts come into play. So even running like a small experiment, if you have any kind of flexibility in your work and you're like, okay, like we could get rid of deployment windows over here for this group, right? Let's do that for a month. Let's see what production is like. Let's measure it closely. And then I would like bring that to whatever executive you want to get involved and be like, this is what we ran. This is what we did. The thing is, like, most executives are not going to write off success and progress. If they see you doing something that's going to greatly benefit them, they're not going to turn their noses up at it, right? But you're going to have to be willing to start by starting and try something small and different. But what I often try to do is just challenge their way of thinking and get them engaged and being like, hey, what like small amount of budget would you be able to help me with? What kind of conversation could you set us up with? What, like, where would you be willing to meet us halfway? So just like sitting down and having an honest conversation, because again, this is more like, it's an eventuality and this is where things are moving. It's just really getting people to think a little bit differently.
Yeah, the one thing that I think you stress, I think to Armory and the organization, and also to me, I think when we go to customers, is that word safe to try, right? It's funny because if I were to go to a VP and say, hey, you know, you really can't be doing this distributed monolith. If you have 35 microservices and you're deploying them all at the same time, you're really defeating the purpose of kind of decoupling these dependencies. And I would just say, hey, let's do something else. That's a very, very scary thing to them. But if you ask them, hey, well, what are you willing to do? What's the one little step? To let them answer, I think is a great way for them to take a step forward, because you'll find that they're actually more willing to do something when it's kind of like their idea, of course, and they feel comfortable with it, versus just having mostly what I've noticed is fear-based conversation around like, oh man, if we decouple it, there's going to be so many other problems. Oh man, if we use chaos engineering, there's like, you want me to, you know, shut down nodes in production? Like, that's crazy, right? But if you ask them, what is that one little step? I think you'll find that these executives are actually more open than what they sound. And I will reemphasize that getting executive buy-in when you're dealing with a migration with something like Spinnaker is just so critical. Like we can see the difference in the culture when the leader is bought into it versus not. And so like the very first step for those on the call that are, you know, going on the Spinnaker journey is to make sure that your leadership is not just saying that they are supportive, but actually being supportive. In what ways are they being supportive? And maybe, Kate, maybe that's another question. Like, what would you consider tangible ways of support? Because I do notice a lot of times that we run into organizations that say, oh, the executive team is aligned, but when you actually see their actions, they're not aligned, right? They're just like, why would they ever say no to an individual contributor that wants to try something? They're like, yeah, go do it. They're not really bought in. What does real support and tangible support look like from an executive to you?
It's a good question. I'd say with any open source project, and Spinnaker, which I think is awesome, right, is it's skin in the game, right? Like you have to contribute to leverage an open source project. Like that is like the absolute beauty in it. So like I'm always asking an executive, like, what are you willing to do? This isn't just about the ICs. Like, what are you willing to do differently? What are you willing to commit to? And like constantly checking in on that. So that could be anything to not just providing funding or having conversations, but like showing up to meetings, tracking things, talking about it in their executive one-on-ones, right? Really spreading the communication, and also kind of like also kind of protecting the project, right? Being like, if you want to run an experiment, what kind of shifting of work do you need? So I had an executive once literally be like, hey, for the 15 of you, I'm willing to like move as much off your plate as possible to try this experiment for 3 months. That was the commitment, right? And she did everything she could. This was a CIO, and was able to kind of protect that space for people to try something new and shift priorities around. And so it's really asking for a commitment and getting them to take like any action and continuously moving it forward. And I think what's really critical is it's like, what problem are you solving for the executives? Like, I usually go in and I try to find out like, what are the things that are keeping this person up at night, right? And then how do I start shifting any of those things to be able to provide value right away? So like, how does Spinnaker, how does an open source project provide value? And again, like, what are they willing to do in getting that commitment and checking in and making sure that happens? So specifics, it could be anything. It's just like, what does skin in the game look like with you? But Isaac is right, because sometimes we'll just hear like people are aligned, but it's really just like, what are they doing to push the ball forward, and how can they help you? So like whatever your ask is, If they're not committing to it, like make it smaller or ask like, what's stopping you from committing to me here and helping me here? If they're not taking any action, that's when you have a problem. That's when they're literally just talking and they're not actually supporting you. But most like times, if people are persistent, they will usually get some kind of action, and you just want to get some centrifugal force going, and you want momentum to happen, right? And you want to make sure that they're tracking this data and they have access to it so they can feel good about the work that you're doing as well. But my answer is skin in the game, just as like contributing to open source code.
That's a great answer. I think we should transition to doing some discussion in Q&A. Isaac, I'll let you finish your thought, and then we can open the floor.
No, that was it. Just to go into Q&A, and just any kind of questions that you all have about the things that Kate and I have been observing and doing with customers. Happy to answer any questions.
And it honestly, I think it dovetails really nicely with what Netflix was talking about regarding managed delivery. I mean, I think in a way that the ideas behind managed delivery are sort of related to this. So any thoughts on that to bring in are also welcome. Speak up, or post in gardening general and I'll be your voice.
Hey, sorry, Rosalind. I had a choppy internet connection there, so I really couldn't hear the question or what the discussion is. Can you repeat that? Sorry.
Isaac, do you wanna intro it? Huh? Or Kate? What are we discussing?
It was really choppy. Sorry. Apologies.
Yeah, no worries. Really, if there are any questions about Spinnaker adoption within inside of your organization, how to unblock that adoption, how to make things go faster, how to get rid, people issues and cultural issues, and maybe there's organizational changes that come along with Spinnaker. Happy to discuss any of those things.
Yeah, sort of the why. I think like kind of talking about the why behind the why. How does the why relate to what we have to get done technically, and how do we deal with that? How do we navigate that?
I'll just share my experiences. You kind of, it may seem scary that you're giving more access to people to, control their software and control their rollouts. But at the end of the day, this only expands your workforce, right? In my opinion. How many times as a developer, have we known how to fix the issue probably in production, but we're gated by this long, archaic process of, step one, whereas you can kind of build these pipelines and have all those best practices of check your, do a security scan, do a check against an audit database of whatever you may need, and just have it automated such that it could just be a click of a button. I know I've been blocked with that a few times. So you also build expertise and knowledge in these areas, so you could build services faster and ultimately fix them faster. So I don't know, but to me, that's how I kind of sold it where I'm at.
And when you were doing that, was the leader kind of on board with that, or did you find yourself running into challenges with the VP or SVP or higher?
I think we had executive buy-in, but it was definitely from an organizational perspective. The buy-in, I think, was not that it wasn't there. It's just that it's easy to say, but it's hard to, until you actually see it done, it's hard to buy into it and, commit to it. So I think that there was kind of a lot of like, yeah, the executives think this is a great idea, but then you go to like, let's say a security team and they're like, oh, no, this is not going to fly. Or you go to like an infrastructure side and like, no, this is not good. You can't just provision VMs. Like, what are you talking about? So I think there was a great example or a discussion point of, start with a minimum viable pipeline, create something and actually show it making a change. I picked one of the smallest apps that had actually no production traffic on it, but it visualized, hey, here's the staging environment, here's the production environment, and it's a click of a button. And obviously there were the questions of, hey, you can't do that. Where is this check? Great, let me add a stage. Oh, you can't do this. Where's this scan? Great, let's work together and include that in this pipeline process. So it opened the door for conversation to grow.
When did you find, like, what was like the turning point for the executives to like be like, yes, we got to do this? Was it just that one app, or was it like a real production traffic app, or what do you think that was for them?
Well, that app eventually did go full production, and then the developers kind of said, we're not going to production with anything else other than Spinnaker. So they kind of like cooed, and they kind of vibed with it. So that's my take on it. It's kind of like once you have it, you're like, I need this. Like, this is, what do you mean? Like, I can't do it the old way. Like, this is so much faster. I got the prod in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
You know, the old way took me, I would have to wait till Tuesday at like 7 o'clock to join some archaic bridge call to discuss my change.
Joel, I love that, because you're talking also about like, yeah, you're like, once you feel it, you're like, I would never go back. And like, that's basically what like most developers say. So it's like, how do you get people to feel that sense of freedom as soon as possible? And so that's why I think I love that you started so small. You're like one app, right? Like that's what we always want to do when we go into a customer. It's like start as small as you can and make it as easy as possible, but like have people just feel that sense of freedom and autonomy. And like, that's just getting the ball going.
At the end of the day,
and now, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say the goal is to build a platform, right? Like, I think this kind of echoes with a lot of the talks or the Spinnaker Summit is build a platform for software delivery, right? So such that people can just subscribe to it and add more apps as they kind of go. So that's the biggest thing. So sorry, go ahead, Isaac. No, that was actually a great point. Kate and I took notes earlier to this call, and we had a whole section to talk about Spinnaker as a platform versus Spinnaker as a CD tool that we actually did not talk about today until you just brought it up. But I think that's a really great point that I think people tend to overlook and throw out Spinnaker with kind of the bathwater, where it's like, oh, Spinnaker doesn't have this one little feature, let me throw it out, versus like, how do we position Spinnaker as a platform inside of the organization to say, hey, Spinnaker doesn't have this feature, let's work together to build it. I really like the approach that you took with your team and the security team or compliance team to do that. It's a way of bringing people in. I think we as a community have a lot of work to do to, I think, give people that mindset, that the first mindset is not one of we do 100% of everything, but we'll get pretty darn close, and as a team, we'll get the rest of it there, right? But let's not throw it away, go back to something like Jenkins, where that only gets us 10% of the way there, and we have to fill in that 90% ourselves. And so that message, I think, is something that I think is an important message as people go on this Spinnaker journey to give back to their organizations, which is, hey, we're going to have to put in some work. It's not going to be as much work as it was before, but we're much closer to our end state where we want to be. I really like that approach that you took. Any other questions? Oh, Edgar.
Sure.
Hi.
Thanks.
Sorry.
No, basically, like in my experience, I've seen different companies, organizations that they want to approach these transformations by the lift and shift. And that brings a lot of frustration because things are not the same in when you're going from the monolithic into the microservices, things are not exactly the same, and they try to fix things that they are moving, and it's ended up like bringing to that team a lot of pressure, and sometimes I've seen failure. So what would you suggest? Is lift and shipping a good strategy? Total refactoring, re-engineering of the processes? I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts about that?
So yeah, I'm happy to chat a little bit about this. So it's also important, right, that like we say like your principles and like roles have to change. And so just like, you can't just like take something out, place something else and just ship it and like see what happens, right? Like you're saying it usually fails because you're basically operating in a new context, right? You can't treat a monolith like microservices. And so we talk about complicated systems and complex systems. So complicated being causal systems, right? You do X, you get Y. And when you have causal systems, right, using rules and strict rules, in monoliths in particular, right? Like it's okay, like that's actually very applicable, right? You're using rules in an accurate way. But when you move to a complex system that is actually not causal, it's unpredictable, you have to have like looser principles that to follow, right? You have to apply like a different set of operating principles to this system, which is what happens in microservices. And so if you're trying to be really strict in microservices, if you're trying to be really strict with Spinnaker, you're going to struggle, right? Because it's actually demanding a different way of operating. So I would say anybody making this shift, Edgar, is like, figure out what are the operating principles that are going to allow you to be most successful in this case, and make sure you're looking at those and putting those in place and agreeing to those before you start actually operating differently. So you've made like this big context shift. And if you don't acknowledge that, that's when companies actually get into a lot of trouble. And like what you're saying is exactly what we see over and over again. You're just thinking it's the same, but like it's actually very different. So principles means like principles and guidelines, right? They're looser things to follow, and like they're like guardrails, which is like what Spinnaker requires. And so it's just important to actually acknowledge them and follow the differences. Do you have anything to add to that, Isaac?
I think you did a great job there, and we're also a bit over time, so I want to be respectful to Rosalind's schedule here. But that was an excellent question, Edgar, and thank you for the conversation there, Joel, too.
Yeah, and if you need a minute or two to wrap it up, that's fine. I just want to be I want to be cognizant not of my schedule, but of our hackers' schedule and our experts, and make sure that they have time to jump back in. And actually, you know what? I do want you to say one more thing. Isaac, were you going to talk a little bit about how, from your perspective, folks can contribute to open source Spinnaker? What does it look like to get started contributing to open source Spinnaker? Why do we do that? Maybe I'm willing to give you a few more minutes if you're willing to talk about that. You know, that's what I eat, breathe. So.
Yeah. So. Where this conversation was supposed to go, but we was really talking about, again, Spinnaker being a platform and being something that we all build on top of to get to that domain-specific software delivery for our organizations. And why is it that you want to build on Spinnaker is because a lot of the core values that we've been discussing today that Netflix, holds are represented inside of Spinnaker. And if you're moving to, something like microservices and need a lot of those cultural values kind of already built into the software, that's why you want to build on top of Spinnaker instead of just starting from scratch with something that's not opinionated like just any old script runner. And so, a lot of what we're doing here in these gardening days is really opening the door, trying to get other people to contribute to help build the platform. And so one of the ways that you all can get started, like quite simply, is really just filing issues and reviewing PRs to get an understanding of what the software looks like, what the code looks like, understanding kind of our coding practices and how we like to interact with the community to accept PRs. If you're not part of Slack, which I imagine many of you are, also participating in SIGs. We are constantly looking for participation, even if you want to demo something you've done, like Joel, like I'm sure a lot of the SIGs would love to see all of the work and integrations that you all have done, so that we can share that with other people in those groups, and we can start thinking about, once we start seeing patterns of people doing a lot of the same thing, then maybe this is something that we bring into open source. So if you guys can join the SIG and share what you're doing, that's incredibly valuable. The other easy places for anybody to start to kind of to grow this community is around just documentation and guides and videos, right? Making it easier for that next person to get started with Spinnaker is incredibly valuable. I remember seeing this like a survey done on Twitter around what makes an open source community great, and by far, the best voting, or the most votes, was actually just documentation and guides. And so just starting from there may not seem like it's a lot of value because it's not code, but it is actually what draws more people into our community. And the more people we have in the community is really what will ultimately make the Spinnaker experience for everybody here a lot better, right? Because there'll be more people to handle bugs, more people to extend the platform out to new cloud providers. And so those are great ways to bring more people and into our community that I think, I mean, for me, this is like a lot of fun because of the people here. Not only are they, some of the smartest people here with respects to software delivery, but they're just really good, fun people. And I see you there, Rob. I've had a lot of fun and drinks with you, and it's a lot of fun, and you can see that in the fact that this community has had a lot of the same people for the last 4 years. They don't just leave. And so there's a great place to start. You can start by just creating your own plugin. Actually, I'll drop it in the chat window. So starting maybe with your own plugin, or going to the gardening day link that I'm going to post here on what to hack would be incredibly helpful. We always want more contributors and people to join our community. So if you guys can get started on that and help build this great platform to be even better, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, and the great thing about that is you did great. It also helps you. It's like we're helping each other, right? Because open source contributions are an excellent thing to put on your resume, like it just hands down, and especially in the continuous delivery space, like there is highly valued on the market, in the marketplace. So, contributing to Spinnaker is a very important line item to build your career path. So we can help you do that. And you're always welcome to reach out to me on Spinnaker Slack if you'd like to give a talk about Spinnaker. Even if you feel like you're a noob, you probably actually have a lot to say, and you can start building your career and mapping your own trajectory based on your experiences with Spinnaker and how you've been able to move the needle with it a little or a lot. So reach out to me if you're interested in speaking opportunities or just being enabled on enabling Spinnaker, because I can do that for you. All right. We are over, so I am going to sign off soon, but I wanted to see if, no, Rin is not in here. There's a person that I really want to sing happy birthday to. So if you don't mind, because it is Rin's birthday today, and Rin is a Kubernetes contributor, a contributor experience Kubernetes contributor who has been pretty prolific, used to work at the New Stack, and Rin is getting into the Spinnaker community now after being in the Kubernetes community for a while. So I want to try to invite Rin. So if you wouldn't mind singing the birthday song in just a minute, let's see if I can find Rin. We'll ping in Gardening General and see if Rin is there. And if not, we'll do it some other time. I'll just move it on the schedule. Thanks. Great talks. Really appreciate this. Oh,
can you hear me?
Yeah, Elizabeth, go ahead, take it away.
I can unplug my mic and then she can hear.
Are you Rin's wife?
Yeah, I'm Rin's wife.
Okay, nice to meet you, Rin. Rin's wife. Anyway, so Rin is a new Kubernetes contributor who wants to come in and help us improve the Spinnaker contributor experience. And it's so important to do that. So without further ado, I would like to wish Rin a very happy birthday and sing Rin the birthday song. And I'm gonna sing it really loud.
Mute all, Roz?
Everyone, just go. I mean, it's gonna sound really gross, but we're gonna do it anyway. So you ready? You can see my fingers on the screen. Light travels faster than sound. So on the count of 3. So when I do this, start singing. 1, 2, there's an app for this. 3. Happy birthday to you. Oh, this is awesome. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Rin. Happy birthday to
you.
Happy birthday, Rin.
By the link to their voice.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rin, for sharing your time with us. This is the epitome of open source, jumping in to help us improve the experience, and we're so grateful to have you. All right, everybody.
Yeah.
Go back to hacking. Thanks for your help. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.